Hello, welcome to the Art Channel. In this film, Joshua and myself are at Tate Britain in London looking at a retrospective on Paula Rego.
Rego is primarily a painter, and her work is characterized by a magical realism, drawing on fairy tales, stories, novels, and also art history. In the first room in the exhibition, we're standing before this painting titled Salazar Vomiting the Homeland, painted in 1960. And here Paula Rego is really expressing her revulsion for the current authoritarian dictatorship of Portugal. And she grows up in this really oppressive political environment. So the act of vomiting by Salazar, alluded to in the title, is really a metaphor, I think, for contempt and a kind of arrogance towards his own people and his own nation. And you can see three very disturbing figures confronting us, including two of the figures vomiting. It's a very visceral reaction, isn't it?
It's, like all of her work, a disturbing painting, and it was not shown for many years after it was painted, probably 10 or 15 years after it was painted. Even her gallery in London refused to show it, apparently because there were so many fallacies in it. It's a really challenging painting, but it reflects a very challenging dictatorship, and she's never shied away from showing us politics with a small p and politics at a regime level, and particularly, I think, with reference to women and the oppression of women.
Yeah, it's really a painting about brutality, but it's very reminiscent too of art being made in Europe in the 1950s. I'm thinking of Art Brut, by artists such as Dubuffet, very primal, instinctual art. I think it's an expressive painting that really channels a very authentic feeling of disgust.
It's interesting because even her fellow artists in Portugal, when it was first shown, were appalled by this piece of painting, and actually some of them have subsequently written about the fact that they were in thrall to the regime. They weren't able to stand up and kind of support her as a painter, and have subsequently talked about their embarrassment about that, actually, because she really was challenging. She was a female painter, as you say, picking up on all of these kind of different strands and attacking a regime in a very brave way, and she's continued to do so.
The reason why we're doing it now is basically because her work seems so prescient and so kind of relevant. But it's something, in terms of the themes and things that Rego responds to, this is something she's been doing throughout her whole career. So she's an absolutely uncompromising artist who has never shied away from any difficult topics or anything that she felt urged to basically talk about. And yet, what I find the most fascinating about this show, which is spanning 60 years of her career, is that when you go from one room to the other, you see the incredible kind of energy with which she was reinventing her work. What I think is extraordinarily powerful about Rego's works is that no matter how serious the issues and topics she's looking at the same time she's constantly thinking or working through reinventing her own very expressive language. They're incredibly visual. All of her works are, in some way, on the face value, you could say they're very accessible. So you get immediately drawn into the image, into the work, but at the same time, you always feel this kind of push and pull and this tension. So you know that there are things going underneath the surface.
Here we're looking at a painting called The Dance, made in 1988. And it's a vast scene of couples and trios and single people dancing on a beach at night under moonlight. And you can see it's a series of women at different stages in their life, based partly on summer holidays that she took with her family on the beach. Disturbingly, the building at the back is based on a fort used for torture under the Salazar regime. But I think what's really fascinating about it is the gaze, or the gazes of all these people, all kind of piercing that space, all looking out in a different direction. Some averting their gaze, some looking directly at us.
Yeah, it's a wonderful painting. I mean, it's really moving and entrancing. It has all that kind of magic of fairy tales and of childhood nostalgia, memories of being a child. Also, memories of being an adult, of courting, of love affairs. So it has a kind of intrigue of a community, of an extended sort of familial group. And you can see a child, can't you, with her mother and grandmother. It's a kind of circle of life there. But there's also a male figure who is the same figure represented twice, and it's Victor Willing, Rhaego's husband, who acts as a sort of player in the scene. So it's a set of relationships in this rather mysterious setting.
It's wonderful and it's disturbing at the same time, isn't it? It's these family groupings, it should be joyous, it's about dance, it's about relationships, it's about, as you say, the circle of life. But that light and that grey sand makes it really quite otherworldly. If it's a fairy tale, it's a Grimm's fairy tale.
Yes, I mean, there's nothing ostensibly threatening per se, except the castle, which acts as a sort of character and a backdrop in the painting. I mean, it is quite a sort of joyous scene, a playful scene, but there's a hint of isolation because, of course, the figure on the far left has no partner. She's the observer.
You're right, should be having a good time. Everybody's kind of smiling, but they're disconnected. There is something, something else is going on.
Paula Rhaego is absolutely one of the best painters in the past 50 years, I think. I mean, her paintings are so memorable, so moving and powerful and haunting, really. I think the sort of key aspect of her work is she takes that kind of Western tradition of narrative, instructional painting from both the Christian church, but also from Greek myth. If you walk through the major galleries of the world, you will see these paintings from the 16th, 17th, 18th centuries, and she gives it this psychological interest rather than one founded in either religion or kind of ancient culture.
I think she's, as you say, a really amazing painter and undervalued. I think she is obviously still relevant because we are still suffering. We still do terrible things to each other, and she's going to always point that out. The way she very bravely has looked at political regimes, violence, abuse, particularly towards women, the way women have been written out of history, sidelined, and looked at anger, actually. All of those things make them, of course, sadly still relevant. And I think as paintings and as drawings, etchings, lithographs, she is an incredible technician. You can't pull this off unless you are really an amazing painter. And as you say, she plucks parts of that expectation of a narrative and completely subverts it. There's no timeline, there's no sense in that way, everything is fragmented. But they do speak of real disturbing truths.
So in her work, you can see this sort of the drawing on of folklore, of fairy tales. And so I think that within the fairy tales particular, that aspect of telling stories, of narratives, there is that potential through the imagination of a kind of empowerment, of flights of fantasy, of remaking the world, of improving the world. And that's quite exciting.
I think when we think about fairy tales, we might think of, the Brothers Grimm, we might think of Angela Carter and that kind of approach to a fairy tale, where it can tell us lots of truths, give us lots of possibilities, because I think you're right, the thing about these paintings is they are full of suffering, but they're kind of full of possibilities. Pathos in suffering is not something I'm particularly comfortable with. I think this is about keeping us awake and keeping us aware of what's going on. I mean, this is political art in the best possible way.